The air inside the alien outpost was heavy and strange, not just because of the atmosphere that made most humans feel like they were breathing through water, but because of the silence that filled the command chamber as the human team stepped inside. Led by Captain Ross, who walked with confidence, even though his eyes moved cautiously from one alien face to another while behind him walked Jack, a communications officer with a sharp mind and a habit of observing everything too closely for his own good. The walls glowed with a soft green hue that pulsed like a heartbeat. The alien stood still, tall and unreadable, with silver blue skin and long eyes that never blinked. Their uniforms were sharp, their weapons always close, and yet it wasn't their appearance that made the humans nervous. It was the presence of one figure standing at the center of the room, facing the giant display on the wall, her back turned, but her authority as solid as steel. That was Commander Lena, known across sectors not just for her victories, but for her ruthlessness. She was feared even by her own people, though she spoke little and revealed nothing. She had led missions into enemy space without backup. She had silenced uprisings with only a glance, and now she stood here, the final word in negotiations that had already been delayed 3 times due to previous cultural clashes between the species. Jack had read every file about her, every recorded word, every political decision she had made. He had memorized her body language, studied her tone, but nothing had prepared him for being in the same room as her, because standing near her felt like being next to a dormant volcano, the kind that didn't need to erupt to remind you of its power. Captain Ross stepped forward to begin the discussion, but as he opened his mouth, a sharp alarm cut through the room, followed by a distorted message from a nearby relay station reporting unauthorized movement along the outer ring. The alien officers turned to Lena, who slowly turned to face the humans, her eyes like polished ice, and said without emotion that the human patrols had entered restricted airspace and violated an ancient code of boundary. The tone in her voice was not anger, it was cold precision, like a blade sliding out of its sheath. Ross tried to explain that had been a navigation error, that the patrol had no knowledge of the restricted path, that no offense had been intended, but Lena did not respond immediately. Instead, she stared at him, as if weighing the value of his life, before slowly looking past him at Jack, who stood silently behind the others, clutching his data tablet. Jack felt her eyes settle on him like a weight, and for a reason he couldn't explain, he stepped forward, not because he had anything urgent to say, but because something in her expression made him feel like the conversation needed grounding, like the room itself might split in two if someone didn't bridge the gap. And without fully thinking, he spoke softly, said that maybe there had been a mistake in their star maps, maybe something was missed during the joint planning, maybe if they looked together, they could avoid this from turning into another diplomatic wound. Lena stared at him, and there was silence. And Jack, in his nervousness, noticed a flicker in her stance, something that wasn't written in her file, something like hesitation, and without realizing what it meant, he reached out and gently placed his hand on her arm, not as a challenge, not as disrespect, but as a human reflex, something meant to show sincerity and calm, something natural to him, something kind. The moment his hand touched her, the air snapped like ice breaking under weight. The other aliens gasped without sound, and the human team froze. Jack saw her eyes widen, not in surprise, but in something colder, something ancient. Her muscles tensed, her face shifted, and then she stepped back slowly, raised her head, and spoke in a voice that carried like thunder, even though it was barely above a whisper. "You touched me, that was a mistake, human." Her words hit the room like a silent explosion. Jack pulled his hand back as if burned and looked around confused, while the aliens looked at Lena in alarm, and the human stood motionless, not sure what had just happened, because to them it had been just a moment of accidental contact, but to her it had been something else, entirely, something deep, something unspoken, but deadly. Lena turned away and spoke a command in her native tongue. The chamber doors slid open, and 2 guards stepped in, weapons not drawn but hands ready. Her expression did not change, but her voice came again, and this time it was directed to Jack only. "You We'll report to my chamber in 1 hour alone then. She turned her back and returned to the display wall, and the meeting was over. The humans walked out in silence. Ross whispered to Jack, asking if he knew what he had done, and Jack said, "No, I was just trying to keep the peace," and Ross shook his head and said, "Well, now you've done the opposite back in the human quarters." Jack tried to understand, tried to find answers in the reports and documents, tried to search the diplomatic guides for what had gone wrong, but nothing explained the reaction. Nothing warned about touching arms, nothing told him what it meant to Lena or her people, and the more he searched, the more he felt the weight of her voice pressing down on him. Thought about not going to her chamber, about claiming ignorance or pleading miscommunication, but something inside him said that would only make things worse, not because he feared punishment, but because he had seen something in her eyes, something that didn't match the cold voice, something wounded, something locked away. So 1 hour later, Jack stood in front of the tall door that led to Commander Lena's chamber. No guards, no ceremony, just silence and the memory of her words repeating in his mind. "Touched me, that was a mistake," and he had no idea what would happen next. Jack stood before the large door made of a smooth dark metal that shimmered faintly under the corridor lights. It looked solid, like something that would not open unless it wanted to, and as he raised his hand to knock, the door slid open without a sound, as if it had been expecting him. He stepped inside, slowly, his heart beating faster with every step, unsure of what he would find inside. The chamber was dimly lit. Strange symbols moved along the curved walls, glowing faintly. The ceiling arched high above, and the air was warmer, thicker, like the atmosphere was trying to press down on him. Commander Lena stood at the far end of the chamber, her back once again turned to him, her hands behind her back, her posture straight and unmoving. The silence between them stretched longer than it should have, but Jack did not speak. He waited, letting the moment unfold on its own terms. Finally, Lena spoke, and her voice did not echo, it simply filled the room completely, like it had weight, like the words themselves were alive. "Do you know what you have done, human?" she said, slowly turning to face him, her eyes fixed on his like sharp stones who crossed a line that should never be crossed. Jack swallowed hard and replied that he did not mean disrespect, he only meant to help, to calm the situation, to make peace. But Lena shook her head and stepped closer, and with every step her presence grew heavier, like gravity itself bent around her, until she stood just a few feet away, and Jack felt small, not just in size but in meaning. "Among my people," she began, "touch is not casual, touch is sacred. Touch is challenge. When one touches another, it is not a gesture of kindness. It is a test of power. It is something our ancestors decided long before your kind walked the stars, and it has never changed. To touch a commander is to claim equality. To touch without invitation is to declare defiance." Jack tried to explain that in human culture, a touch on the arm meant understanding, compassion, even unity, but the words felt weak as he said them, and Lena listened with a face that showed nothing, no anger, no acceptance, only calculation. "You are fortunate," she said at last, "that I am not like the others, fortunate that I have learned enough of your kind to see when ignorance is real and when insult is intended. Had you touched another, had this happened on a different world, you would not be standing here." She walked past him slowly, like a storm passing over a field, and stood near a small pedestal on which floated a shimmering device. She placed her hand over it, and an image appeared hovering in the air, recording of a different human, an ambassador long ago, reaching out and brushing the shoulder of an alien officer, and then being struck down by guards. Without warning, the image faded, and Lena turned back toward Jack. "This happened 12 cycles ago." She said, "It almost started a war, and it ended the life of a man who did not understand, and now here you are repeating the same mistake." Jack felt a chill as he watched the scene again in his mind, realizing that what he had done was more than a mistake. It was a memory revived, a wound reopened, a history disrespected, and yet Lena had not punished him, not yet, and that confused him more than anything. "Why did you not order my removal?" he asked quietly. "Why did you not have me taken by your guards like before?" Lena looked at him, then truly looked, not with judgment, but with something else, something slower, something tired. "Because I do not want war," she said, "and because for a moment when you touched me, I felt something unfamiliar, something that did not match the records, something not aggressive, not false." She walked toward a large window that overlooked the outer sectors of the base. Stars blinked in the distance, and ships moved like shadows across the horizon. She stood there in silence, and Jack remained where he was, unsure whether to speak again, unsure if he had already said too much. "You see, human," she said softly, "the laws I follow are not just rules, they are the threads that hold my people together. But those threads are fraying, times are changing, and there are voices on my council who wish to end the alliance with Earth. They believe humans are careless, undisciplined, too emotional to trust. They believe your kind is dangerous because you do not understand what things mean beyond your own customs." Jack stepped forward slowly, not wanting to cause another mistake, and said, "Then teach me, let me understand. Help me see what your people carry, so I do not make it worse again." Lena turned slightly, and for the first time, her expression shifted, a small subtle movement at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but not anger either. "You asked to understand," she said. "Many ask to speak, few ask to listen." "Then let me listen," Jack said, "because I think your people and mine need more listeners and fewer orders." Chamber fell silent again, but it was a different silence, not heavy, not sharp. It was calm, like something had shifted just slightly enough to matter, and Lena stepped closer until she was once again only a breath away from him, but this time she did not look like a storm. "Then listen," she said, "and tomorrow you will stand before my council and explain your mistake yourself, and if they accept your words, then this matter will end, and if they do not, then I cannot protect you." Jack nodded, once knowing what that meant, but also knowing that now he was part of something larger than just an error. He had stepped into a culture built on deep meaning and pain, and now he carried the weight of more than just his own choices. He carried the chance to fix something long broken, and as he left the chamber, the door sliding shut behind him, he did not feel afraid, he felt ready. The next morning arrived slowly. The light in the alien sector moved in soft waves, not like sunlight, but something more controlled, more designed. And as Jack woke from a restless sleep, the thoughts of the night before still sat heavy in his chest. His mind returned again and again to Lena's voice, the warning, the history, the meaning of touch, and now the coming challenge that waited ahead as he would stand before the council of her people, not as a guest, not as an officer, but as a human who had broken a rule that carried weight older than many worlds. He dressed in the uniform he had worn on the day of arrival, the cloth still carrying the faint scent of alien air, and stepped into the corridor where a silent escort stood waiting. The guards did not speak, their faces calm but distant. They walked in perfect rhythm, their boots making no sound on the dark floor, and Jack followed without resistance, knowing that whatever waited ahead could not be avoided. The council chamber was different from any place Jack had ever seen. It was round, wide, and filled with an energy that seemed to vibrate in the air. The walls were covered in carvings that shimmered when looked at directly, as if the images themselves moved through time. The ceiling, high and domed, displayed a living sky, stars swirling slowly above them, like a reminder that every decision here reached beyond just one world. The council members sat in a wide circle, each one draped in layers of cloth marked by color symbols, and ranked, their faces mostly unreadable, but Jack could feel the weight of their eyes as he stepped into the center, where a single platform rose just slightly from the floor. Lena stood nearby, but not beside him, her position clear. She would not speak for him, he would have to carry his words alone. Elder seated at the front raised a hand, and the air shifted, signaling the start, and then he spoke, his voice deep and slow, asking Jack if he knew why he had been summoned here, and Jack nodded once, saying, "Yes, I know, and I'm ready to answer," and the elder told him to begin. Jack took a breath and looked around, not at the carvings, not at the lights, but at the people, the faces, the watchers, and he began to speak slowly, carefully, choosing his words not from fear, but from a need to reach across the space between them. He said that he had made a mistake not by intent, but by ignorance, that among humans touch was not always about power or challenge. That sometimes it was the only way they knew to show they were listening, to show they were present, to show they meant no harm. He said that when he placed his hand on Commander Lena's arm, he was not challenging her, he was not testing her strength. He was trying to bridge a gap, to bring calm to a moment where fear and misunderstanding could take over, and in that moment he failed to remember that what was natural for one species might carry a deep and painful meaning for another. He said he was sorry not just to Lena, but to all who carried the memory of past violations, who lived with the legacy of wounds left by other hands and other empires. He said that learning was the first step to peace, and that he stood here not to beg forgiveness, but to offer understanding in return for theirs. There was silence when he finished, not heavy, but thoughtful, and the elder looked to the others, who spoke among themselves, their voices low and strange like wind moving through stone. And then Elder turned back and asked Jack one question: if touch is natural to your kind, would you risk touching again, even knowing what it could cost? Jack stood still for a moment and then said, only if invited, and that answer seemed to settle the air like a soft weight pressing down and then lifting again. The elder nodded slowly, but did not speak. Instead, he raised his hand, and from the side of the chamber, a new voice called out. It was sharp, clear, and carried not peace but accusation, and everyone turned as a tall figure stepped into the light, his face narrow, his eyes fierce, his clothing marked with the red crest of the internal command. His name was Toran, a senior enforcer of cultural law, and one who had long spoken against the human alliance. Stepped forward and said that words were easy, but trust was fragile, that humans had already broken too many codes and too many promises, that this incident was not just about one touch, but about a pattern of disrespect, and that Jack should not be allowed to walk free just because he spoke nicely in front of the council. Some of the members nodded, others looked uneasy. Lena remained silent, but her eyes had narrowed slightly, as if sensing something deeper in Turan's words, and Jack felt the mood shifting, the room tilting slowly away from balance. Turan turned toward the council and said there were reports of human interference in restricted data channels, said that Jack's presence here might be part of a larger plan, that this touch was not innocent, but calculated to create tension, to test boundaries. And when Jack stepped forward to deny it, Turan raised a device in his hand and said the evidence had been found only last night, hidden inside the signal archives. The elder frowned and asked why such evidence was not brought forward earlier, and Turan said it was because the humans had friends in high places, and those friends wanted to protect one of their own, even at the cost of truth. The room grew colder, the lights dimmed slightly, and Jack looked to Lena, hoping for a sign, but she stood still, her face unreadable, and Turan stepped closer, saying that justice must be done, that respect must be enforced, not with speeches, but with action, and he demanded that the council strip Jack of his protection and turn him over to military court for direct judgment. Jack felt the floor shift beneath him, not literally, but inside his mind, as if the whole space was becoming something else, something more dangerous, and he saw now that this was never just about a touch. It was about power, about old anger, about those who wanted the alliance to end. And Lena was right, the threads were fraying, and now someone was pulling them on purpose. And as the elder prepared to speak and give his decision, Jack raised his voice once more and said, then let me face your truth, but let it be real and open, and not decided by secrets in the dark, because if we break this moment, then we may never have another. The elder looked at him for a long moment, and then turned toward Lena and said, your voice brought him here. Does it still hold him now? And the room fell into waiting, and Lena slowly stepped forward, her eyes still calm, but with something rising behind them, something cold and clear and ready. The room held its breath as Lena stepped forward, her footsteps slow and deliberate, the sound of her boots soft against the floor, yet somehow louder than anything else. Her presence pulled all attention away from Turan, away from Jack, even away from the elder, who now watched her with careful eyes, because what Lena was about to say could shape not just the fate of one man, but the balance between two worlds, and everyone in the chamber knew it. She looked at the elder first, then at the rest of the council, and finally at Tehran, who stood straight and proud, his eyes filled with confidence that she would side with him, that she would honor the weight of tradition and silence the human who had dared to cross a sacred line. But Lena did not speak right away. Instead, she turned her gaze to Jack, who stood without fear, without retreat, and something flickered in her thoughts, not weakness, not doubt, but memory, something old, something heavy. This human, she began, her voice calm but sharp, has admitted his mistake. He has spoken with more courage than many who sit behind these walls. He has not denied our pain, nor tried to excuse it. He has asked to understand, and even now, when surrounded by doubt and blame, he stands with honesty, not with force. Tehran moved forward again, saying that honesty was not enough, that a single respectful speech could not erase centuries of insult, that the human presence here had always been a risk, and now it had proven itself to be a danger. But Lena raised her hand and the chamber fell silent again. You speak of danger, she said, but danger is not in words alone. Danger hides in shadows and in secrets and in the twisting of truth. And there is something here that does not feel true. There is something in your evidence that tastes of manipulation. And I have learned over many cycles that truth cannot survive where fear is planted. The elder leaned forward, asking Lena if she challenged the evidence itself, and she said, not yet, but I challenge the intent behind it, because I have seen this play before. A voice raised against peace, a hand moving in darkness, trying to break what is still healing, and Tehran's face grew tense as she spoke, his grip tightening around the device in his hand, and for the first time he did not speak back. Lena turned again, this time facing the entire council, and said, there was a time when we were ruled by fear, when every outsider was seen as a threat, when we built walls so high we forgot to look beyond them, and now we are here, standing on the edge of something better, and we are being asked to step back into that fear because of one human's mistake, one moment, one misunderstanding. She looked to Jack once more, and there was no anger in her eyes, no coldness, only a strange warmth that did not match her reputation, and she said, I do not believe he came here to cause harm. I do not believe he touched me to claim power. I believe he touched me because he thought he could stop a moment from falling apart, and maybe he did, because now we are here, and the walls have not yet closed. Elder rose slowly, his face still unreadable, and said, then what is your judgment, Commander? Lena, the council will hear your decision, and honor it, for this matter is yours to carry. The silence returned once more, and Lena took a breath that felt like it pulled the stars themselves into her chest. She looked at Tehran one last time and said clearly, I do not seek punishment, I seek understanding. I will not allow fear to speak louder than truth, and I will not surrender one who seeks to listen to the cold hands of those who only seek to silence. And with that the council shifted. Murmurs passed from one side to another. The elder gave a single nod, and the guards stepped back, signaling that the trial had ended, that Jack was no longer bound by accusation. But even as relief began to rise in his chest, even as the weight of the moment began to loosen, the ground shook beneath their feet, and a sharp alarm burst through the chamber air. Red lights flashed across the walls. The dome ceiling above shifted from stars to a warning display as emergency protocols activated. The elder barked a command in the ancient tongue, and the walls shifted open, revealing secondary exits. Lena turned her head quickly toward the far corner of the chamber, where a control unit blinked with strange symbols, unfamiliar patterns, and she spoke fast and sharp. Someone has breached internal security. Jack ran beside her as the council guards moved into action, and the elder was escorted from the chamber. Tehran remained frozen, his eyes locked on the blinking device on the floor, and Lena saw it too, and her voice dropped low, saying, this was planted. This is not just politics, this is an attack from within. Lights dimmed, the walls began to pulse, and a voice came through the communication line, not a warning, but a declaration, a message broadcast across the Outpost, a voice filled with anger, saying the alliance is a lie, saying the humans must leave, saying the cleansing begins. Now Lena turned to Jack and said, this is not your mistake. This is someone else's plan and you walked into it by accident. And now we must survive it together. And Jack nodded without hesitation. Because now the lines were clear, and the danger was no longer about culture or misunderstanding, but about war. Turan moved, then suddenly fast, grabbing the device and trying to retreat through the side exit. But Lena's command was quicker, and 2 guards stopped him, weapons raised, and she ordered that he be taken into custody and everything he brought be examined, because this had gone far beyond council laws. And into betrayal. Outside the chamber, the hallways filled with soldiers. Alarms continued to blare, and emergency shields began to rise around critical areas. Jack followed Lena through the control center, where data feeds showed small explosions near the dock area, attempts to sabotage systems, and messages filled with hate from unknown sources. This was not just one man, this was a movement waiting to ignite. And the touch that began it all had simply been the excuse, the spark in dry grass. Lena gave orders with speed and precision, her voice steady, even as the outpost shook with another distant blast. And Jack watched her, not with fear, but with something else, something closer to trust, because whatever she had once been, cold or distant or feared, she was now the only one standing between chaos and survival. And as they reached the defense command room, and the final barrier doors sealed behind them, Jack looked at her and said, we are in this now together. And Lena did not argue. She only said, then let us not fail. The defense room was built like the heart of the outpost, deep beneath the main levels, wrapped in layers of metal and energy shields, but now even its thick walls trembled under the weight of what was happening above. The lights flickered, the sound of distant explosions echoed through the lower corridors, and the main screen displayed a growing number of red signals, each one marking a point of breach or sabotage, each one a sign that the uprising was spreading. Faster than expected, Lena stood at the center, her hands moving quickly over the console, her voice clear and focused as she issued commands. Rerouted power, sealed off weak points, and ordered her officers to hold their ground. She moved like someone who had trained for this moment for years, not because she wanted it to happen, but because she always knew it could. And Jack stood beside her, doing what he could, taking in sensor readings, reading out reports, and watching her more closely than anything else. You still think this started with me? He asked between updates, and Lena looked at him only briefly, her face calm, but her voice holding something softer now. And she said, no, I think this started long before you ever touched my arm, and I think you only stepped into it by being human in a place where people still fear what being human means. Rebel attacks were not random, they were focused and calculated, aimed at key systems, power nodes, communication lines, escape routes. Someone had planned this not just as a protest, but as an attempt to seize control, to divide the alliance permanently. And the more Jack read, the more it became clear that these attackers were not just angry, they were organized, and someone had been feeding them from inside. Lena paused for a moment and turned to the screen, where a name appeared at the center of the coded messages. Turan. He was not just a voice of opposition, he'd been the architect of the betrayal. He had waited for a mistake, something simple, something emotional, something human, and then he had used it to light the match. We must end this now, Lena said, not with speeches, not with more delays, but with action. And Jack asked how, and she looked at him, not like a commander, but like someone carrying more than orders. She said, we cut off their control, we take back the central core, we turn off their access to the outer systems, and once they are blind and deaf, they will lose momentum, and we take them alive so that no one calls them martyrs. Jack nodded and said, then let us go, and together they moved through the lower passageways, followed by a small team of loyal guards, each step echoing louder, each turn bringing them closer to the center of the chaos above them. The sound of weapons fire rang out, and emergency lights flashed along the walls. But they kept moving, not because they were fearless, but because fear no longer mattered. When they reached the central core, They found it under siege, a small group of rebels already inside. Trying to override the final layer of system control, Lena did not hesitate. She gave the order, and her team moved in a quiet storm of precision and discipline. Jack followed close behind, ducking for cover, scanning for access panels, and doing what he could with his limited training. The fight was brief, but sharp, and when it ended, 2 rebels were down, 1 injured, and the others disarmed and held. Lena walked to the control terminal and placed her hand on the main pad, her biometric signature, unlocking the override and shutting down the network nodes that had been hijacked. Across the outpost, the screens blinked and then shifted back to their usual patterns. The red alerts faded one by one, and the silence that followed was the silence of something broken and stopped. "It is done," Lena said, and her voice was not proud, it was tired. Jack looked at her and said, "Then the Alliance is safe," and she replied, "For now, but safety is not a permanent state. It must be defended again and again, even from those within." They returned to the council chambers, where the elder stood once more, this time not in ceremony, but in recovery. The council had gathered again, not to judge, but to witness. Lena stood before them and told the truth, not just about Tehran, but about the threat that had grown in silence. She spoke of fear, of pride, of mistakes, and of the one human who had not run when it would have been easier, who had stayed and faced a culture not his own with nothing but honesty and a willingness to listen. The council did not speak at first. Then the elder stepped forward and said that the Alliance had been tested and had bent, but not broken, and that those who still carried hate would no longer shape their future. And then he turned to Jack and said, "You came here as a visitor, you became a problem, and then you became a mirror. And sometimes a mirror is more useful than a weapon." Lena walked with Jack later down the same hallway where he had first arrived, the lights above calm now, the shadows no longer heavy, and she said, "When I first saw you, I thought you were another mistake, another storm in disguise." And Jack smiled and said, "I thought you were going to destroy me." And she said, "Maybe I was, and maybe I should have. But instead we both changed." They reached the docking bay where Jack's team waited, preparing for departure. The mission was over, the trial was complete, the danger had passed for now, and Lena turned to him one last time and said, "You touched me once, and it was a mistake by our law, but maybe not a mistake for our future." Jack looked at her and said, "Then maybe one day you will invite it, not because of law, but because you want to." And Lena nodded once, and then walked away, her steps quiet but sure, her path no longer alone. And as Jack boarded his ship, the engines rising beneath him, the outpost shrinking behind the windows, he looked out at the stars and knew that one touch, one moment, had rewritten more than just his own story. It had rewritten the story of 2 worlds, the end.